Thank you, Ron Tompkins, for coming to have an interview here today. I recall actually the first time that I met you in 2017. I think it was at the Stanford Symposium at Ron's house after the symposium, or the community day, I think. And you weren't working on MECFS much at the time. I mean, I knew you were someone who'd done a lot of research in a lot of different fields, specifically around trauma. But I really remember that you had a really great understanding of MECFS from my perspective and the perspective of people I had collaborated with. I'd been working on MECFS for 7 years. Collaborators have been working on it for decades. And yeah, I was really impressed by that effectively. And so I guess digging into more of the work that you've done and more of the history of the work that you've done, and kind of get a better understanding of how you kind of came to that kind of understanding in regards to MECFS. I'm speaking, I guess, a lot about the Glue Grant, which I find a really fascinating project as one of the major things that you've accomplished in your career. And now we're in a pandemic 3 years later, and it's becoming all too more relevant again. So I thought I might start with that, chat a little bit about your work in the Glue Grant and how it may be relevant to this COVID-2ME project that we're doing collaboratively here.
Well, thank you, Chris. I recall our first meeting, and I was very impressed with a young man that was very interested in metabolism and a deep understanding about this particular problem. And I'm delighted that you've chosen to spend quite a bit of your career here trying to understand this problem. With Ron Davis, over the last few decades, we have explored a great deal in the whole field of injury research. And the Glue Grant was a $100 million project funded by the NIH to better understand from a what's called genomic or gene expression perspective, as well as from protein changes, as well as metabolic features that occur when one is injured seriously enough to die. And the patients we studied had a 20% mortality rate. So it's very important to understand how the human system responds when you have a 1 chance in 5 of dying. It's about as severe stress as is possible. But in doing so, we had over 100 principal investigators and over 10 years to begin to understand and collect information in a very systematic way to how the human system responds in circumstances like that. I was very delighted that just getting together, we improved the survival rate by 50%.
Wow.
In major blunt trauma. And over the last few decades, our interest in the field of burns, we've almost eliminated the mortality in pediatric and children who are severely burned. The expectation is to survive. So I am very excited about the fact that if one takes science and really begins to apply it to clinical medicine, you can make a huge difference. My relationship with Ron Davis, who's gradually over time had to be interested in MECFS because of his son, has continually asked me about things as a doctor, for part of me as a scientist and part as a doctor. And I would just simply answer his questions. And both of us came to the realization that much of what we were learning in the area of injury was extremely applicable to this disease, MECFS. And so I've become more engaged to use that information that we gained after a tremendous experience in better understanding ME and how it occurs, and the inability to understand its etiology. I hate to use that word, but reason that it exists, and why doesn't it resolve normally?
I think that's the, and I guess I'd summarize that as looking at kind of that transition from the acute to a chronic disease state, and how that triggering component kind of interacts. And that obviously is super relevant to this COVID-19 research that we're looking into. But also it's probably interesting enough to talk about the common pathways, I guess, the body kind of goes through, or the stress pathways that it goes through in response to all varieties of different types of stresses. Obviously, you're talking about trauma or blunt trauma or burns in this case for the glue grant, but then you have infection and all these other ones. So what is, I mean, do we know that there is a common kind of path that is taken?
Well, let's just think about it, Chris. It's only been the last 4 or 5 decades, if you were incredibly ill, sick, that you would even survive. And that has purely been the result of our understanding of how to deal with critical care medicine. In the past, over our entire history, if you were incredibly sick, let's say you fell off a cliff and broke bones, you crawl back into the cave, you know, your family brought you maybe some twigs, leaves, and water, but you either survived or didn't. And it really was rather local injuries that actually allowed you to survive. If there were any terrible infection or terrible injury, you were left behind and eaten. And there was no, I'm just speaking from an evolutionary perspective, there was no advantage that genetics could provide that will allow you to survive. It's only been in the last 50 years that if you got that sick, you were going to be able to survive. So to come up with an evolutionary argument why I would respond differently to a terrible infection as opposed to a terrible injury is hard to make, because you would have simply died, and that you would not have lived long enough to reproduce. There is no evolutionary pressure that would come up and say, as a human, you know, I have a special response to infection. Yeah. It's just you would have simply had died. So it is reasonable that any serious stress and the recovery from it is rather common, more than different. I don't understand how you would have distinctions.
So that, I guess that's very relevant for the rationale we took for the looking into the COVID-19 to ME and using this kind of opportunity, I would say. And I guess it is a massive opportunity, not just because of the global interest, but also that you have the ability to identify people going through an infection right at the beginning of an infection, where usually there isn't as much attention paid to that occurring, and these people are popping up in the ICUs at hospitals. So I guess we can talk about that project and maybe give an update on how that's going.
This is the SARS coronavirus 2 is a very, what we would call pro-inflammatory virus, such that its infection creates a tremendous inflammatory reaction. And it can, in some individuals it's pretty minor, but at least in the acute disease, and by acute disease I mean over the first 24 hours. What we're observing, however, is those who do survive, those who have been hospitalized, that if they're lucky enough to be discharged, that over the next 4 to 6 months, they're having persistent symptoms, very often pulmonary, but also other symptoms. And we're also seeing a second group of individuals whose original illness wasn't terrible enough for them to be hospitalized, but yet after 4 to 6 weeks, their symptoms not only don't resolve, but evolve and might even be worsening. So we're seeing this entire very significant population who, over the next 6 months after the original illness, have persistent and evolving symptoms. And the NIH has described that as post-acute coronavirus sequelae, PACS, PACS. It's really the same as long COVID, in which you just fail to recover from this horrendous stress. And unfortunately, it's not just restricted to those who had a severe illness. There are some whose illness was not that severe, and yet they are continuing to suffer, and if not even persist and get worse. And so I do think this is an opportunity to better understand what loosely has been termed post-infectious fatiguing illnesses, of which, in my opinion, ME/CFS is one of those. So because this is affecting millions, and to the point where at least the United States government is so concerned about it, they invested $1.15 billion in order to understand better, so that in the future we're not going to be surprised. So we have this 1.15 billion to better understand how this disease process evolves. And in my opinion, some of the symptoms of individuals over 6 to 12 months will simply be persistent damage to organs like their lungs or in the central nervous system or cardiac or other areas. And you can do normal blood tests or images and identify persistent organ damage. But at some point, those studies are going to become normal or not abnormal, and yet the symptoms are still present, which is very much what patients with ME/CFS face every day. They have very significant symptoms, yet the standard tests don't show abnormalities. And I think this is going to be a fabulous opportunity to be able to watch this process happen. And at 12 to 24 months, where you have blood tests and x-rays and all sorts of images, and there's no organ damage to blame, yet the patients are still suffering from this, I hate to even use the word fatigue, but it is an energy problem that if they exceed their threshold, they will pay a huge price. And it's difficulty focusing, their dysautonomic symptoms. And I think it is, I hate that it had to occur because of a pandemic, but I think it's going to be such a big issue that we're going to learn something from this.
Yeah, I would certainly say so. And I guess the study design we've gone for, and the reason why we're so interested in the ICU patients or hospitalized cases, if we can get to them, or even the non, is to get to them at the point when they've had this infection. And I believe that was to do with some of the work that you've done on that glue grant in the past, looking at trauma and identifying that some of the clinical trajectories, the different clinical trajectories from trauma over time, and the length of duration of recovery. Some of those markers were kind of established very early on in the infection phase or the acute phase. Is that correct? And is that kind of where we're at as well with the study? We're looking at the first week or the first week of infection effectively to look for these markers, and then following them on to see what they may link to in terms of clinical recovery?
The aspect of there are multiple aspects of the glue grant that are very relevant. You can appreciate if you were hit by a bus that you end up in the intensive care unit. You also ended up probably with a lot of operations, but we did learn a tremendous amount about how the white blood cells respond over time. And I can tell you that 80% of all the human genes respond in a maximum response actually within the first day or so after the injury. So we've called that a genomic storm, because every single gene that could have responded, all human genes, 80% of them did respond in your circulating blood. Similarly, in each of our tissues, and the other tissues that we studied are ones that we could biopsy, and that was muscle and skin and fat. Because we were doing operations, we could look at individual tissues. But we used that as a reflection of what probably happens in all of our organ systems. And each of those had a very similar dramatic response. So we know a lot about how genes respond. And as a result of the genes, we also understand in separate studies about proteins. And we have for many years known quite a bit about how small molecules, how the molecular metabolic response occurs. And there is a very consistent coordination among all of those systems that occurs after injury. And it is our hypothesis or a thought that these are going to be very similar after very serious viral infections. And to a major degree, what we've observed in patients who've had a very serious COVID infection, it's a very inflammatory response. They're describing it as a cytokine storm. These are all things that we routinely see after injury. And it is our expectation that the genetics or genomic response is going to be comparable. Now, what happens then is you have patients who recover normally or rapidly, relatively rapidly. You can imagine being hit by a bus and you're not going to just jump out of bed, but it may take you a few months, but you will ultimately be normal. Be healthy, but it may take a few months, but that would be the very best human recovery possible. You can also imagine that there are individuals in which it's going to take them more than 6 months, but they will eventually be normal. And you would call that something like a delayed recovery, but a recovery nonetheless. And there are going to be individuals who not only are delayed, but never actually return to normal. So there is what we call an uncomplicated recovery. You were hit by a bus, but you did recover. And then there's complicated but recovery. And then there's complicated and you never actually make it all the way back. So those are basically 3 different types of recoveries, and you can associate those with genetics and with proteomics and with metabolomics. And it really might be useful in 2 ways. One, if you could use them for prediction, and you could very early identify those who are going to have problems so that you might treat them differently than others. And number two, you can take advantages of those differences, and it's possible they can become targets for treatments, so that it's potentially those targets could be used as therapeutic targets to improve. So those are the major motivations to take what we know with injury and maybe apply some of those concepts in this possibility of development of ME after this terrible infection.
Yeah, I mean, that's really fascinating, and I think a great rationale for the reasons for doing this study. I kind of want to go over a few of these other projects that you've been up
Sure.
doing. I mean, I think one of the more fascinating ones for me, and probably one of urgent need, is the PASS-CAT program. Maybe you could do a little brief introduction of that, and we can talk a little bit more about that.
The PASS-CAT is, and let me try to remember what PASS stands for. It's a patient assessment of symptom system, so that it's a computerized ability for patients to take their time that would very carefully characterize whether they have what I would call a sentinel symptom that the doctor should be aware of. And so let's talk about a couple of symptoms of ME that are very characteristic of ME, that if present, the doctor should stop, listen, and pay attention to. And I think one of those is post-exertional malaise. And I mentioned it a little bit, but with expenditure of energy, patients know they're going to pay a price for it. Number one, they have a threshold, and if they remain below that threshold, they can survive reasonably. But if they cross that threshold, they're going to pay a tremendous price for it. I know this is loosely termed as fatigue, but this is a very more specific form of fatigue, and it's not something that doctors are traditionally aware of or pay attention to at all. I call it a sentinel symptom. And if that type of symptomatology exists, the doctor should stop, look, and listen and do something about it. I don't know what the problem is, but it is a symptom that should be, it's not in your head, it's not psychosomatic, you're not depressed, it's real. And so the other part of it is CAT, and CAT is computerized adaptive testing. And what it has to do is, it's been used in testing methodologies all over. If you do certification exams and all sorts of computer testing,